I'm Peter Carr. I'm just going to show you briefly how you might cut a rock block or a masonry block, in particular made of concrete, using a hammer and bolster and also a brick scutch.
There are a number of ways to cut a concrete block. We can of course use the wet brick saw or a 9-inch or 235mm masonry grinder, which is popularly used by bricklayers in central Queensland or North Queensland area. If we were to use a hammer and bolster, it would be done in a similar way as to cut the brick with a hammer and bolster. I prefer having the brick facing away from me and making sure that the bolster is not out of alignment when it's rested on the brick to be cut. Keep your hand firmly down, pressing down on the brick as the lump hammer strikes the bolster. It's even also more important that the correct surface is used to cut the brick on. As you can see, underneath the brick was some sand. You could also use some loose gravel. That way it cushions the blow and the brick tends not to then fracture or crack under the blow. The block's done in a similar way. Because, however, the block is so wide, it's easier not to just hold the ruler beside the block and use your hammer and bolster to make sure it's being cut in a straight line. It's preference to mark the block. You can either mark each side of the block and draw a line across, as was just shown, or simply hold the finger against the edge of the block and drag the ruler across. Both sides of the block need to be marked. Once both sides of the block have been marked, it can be cut. Instead of one crisp, very firm blow with the hammer onto the bolster, as was done on the brick, the block needs to be done with a little less strength and more patience. 2 strikes on either side of the block are done initially, and there you can see that the crack has immediately occurred. One side of the block was cut very successfully, the other side not so successfully. If it was laid as a common block, there would be no problem at all. If, however, it was done as a face work on both sides, the block would need to be recut. The scutch hammer can be used successfully, though, to make adjustments to the block. When using the scutch hammer, it's best to strike down rather than across the block face to avoid cracking off pieces of the block. We're going to redo another block to ensure that both sides of the block are cut neatly. It is marked again in the same manner and then struck, keeping the hand firmly against the bolster but not tapping too softly nor too hard. 1, 2 blows, another one. Obviously at the time the block felt like the strike wasn't firm enough. Using the other marked line, struck again firmly, not smashing it though. If the block doesn't break on both sides being cut, it's good practice to strike then with the hammer and bolster on the top of the block. You would flip the block upright, strike each of the webs on either side where the pencil marks have been drawn. And this was unnecessary on this occasion, the block being cut fairly easily. The scutch hammer is again used to clean the cut face or the cut edge. This block could be laid into face block work. Now, a block can also be cut using simply the scutch hammer or even a brick hammer. I prefer to use the scotch hammer than the brick hammer. With the teeth on the scotch comb, it tends to eat into or securely strike into the block itself. The block's marked with a pencil and then struck along that marked line with the scotch hammer. Be again patient with the cutting, striking it firmly, not wanting the hammer to bounce too much off the block. The sand again underneath cushions the block as it's being struck. As mentioned, before blocks struck sitting upright and then flipped upside down if it hasn't cracked already on the lines cut. If the block still hasn't then been cracking or being cut successfully along the previous struck mark, the same process is repeated, and then voila, patient but successfully cut. Pieces that weren't cut neatly off need to be neatened up. So not all is lost if you don't have a grinder, masonry grinder, or a wet saw to cut blockwork. This technique was often used on brick bases or block bases where it can be a hassle to set up the wet brick saw. Here I'm just simply showing the difference between the brick hammer and the scotch hammer.